They thought they were removing an unwanted guest from a proud military ceremony, but before the morning was over, the entire auditorium would learn what honor really looks like. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The spring sun shined brightly over the Naval Academy grounds in Annapolis, Maryland, casting warm light across rows of white stone buildings and neatly trimmed lawns. Families in pressed suits and elegant dresses moved toward Grant Hall with cameras, flowers, and proud smiles. Today was graduation day, the kind of day parents remembered for the rest of their lives. Inside the grand auditorium, polished wood floors gleamed beneath crystal lights, and every seat near the front carried the silent message of status. In the middle of that polished crowd stood Margaret Hayes, a woman many eyes dismissed in a single glance. She wore a simple navy dress that had been carefully pressed the night before, sensible low heels, and a light cardigan folded over one arm. Her silver blonde hair was pinned back neatly, and in her hand she held a plain envelope with her son's name written across the front in black ink, Ethan Hayes. She was 52 years old, stood with straight shoulders, and carried herself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had long ago stopped needing approval from strangers. Margaret paused near the front row and checked the seat number written on her ticket. Row A, Seat 4. Her son had mailed it himself with a short note that she had read so many times the edges were soft. Save me a smile, Mom. She touched the envelope gently, then smiled to herself. Around her, whispers rose and faded like waves. Guests compared hotel reservations, careers, and future assignments. Watches flashed beneath expensive sleeves. Perfume drifted through the air. A man in a charcoal suit glanced at Margaret's modest shoes, then looked away with faint amusement. A woman wearing pearls tightened her lips as if simplicity itself had offended her. Margaret noticed none of it, or perhaps she noticed all of it and simply chose peace. She stepped toward row A just as two uniformed security guards moved in front of her. The first was broad-shouldered with a polished badge that read Ryan Cole. The second, taller and younger, wore the practiced expression of someone who enjoyed authority a little too much. Ma'am, Ryan said, holding out one hand, these seats are reserved for distinguished families and special guests. Margaret lifted her ticket calmly. Yes, she replied. My son sent this to me. Derek Mills barely glanced at the paper before giving a short laugh. There must be some mistake, he said. General seating is in the back section. Margaret's eyes remained steady. No mistake. My son graduates today. He wanted me close enough to see him cross the stage. The guards exchanged a look. Around them, nearby guests pretended not to listen while hearing every word. Chairs creaked. Programs rustled. A hush began to spread. Ryan lowered his voice, though not enough to hide the condescension in it. Ma'am, let's not make this difficult. We need to keep this area for people who belong here. For the first time, something flickered behind Margaret's calm expression. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something older than both. She glanced once at the stage where rows of empty chairs waited for the graduating class, then back at the guards blocking her path. I do belong here, she said softly. I'm his mother. The room did not know it yet, but those 5 words were about to shake every assumption inside those walls. The words settled into the air with a weight neither guard expected. For a brief moment, even the rustling programs nearby went still. Then Derek Mills gave a thin smile that carried no warmth. Everyone says they belong in the front when the cameras come out, he said. Please head to the rear seating section, ma'am. Margaret Hayes looked at him quietly, the kind of look that often made louder people uncomfortable. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply held out the ticket again. The cream paper was slightly worn from being folded and unfolded all week. Row A, Seat 4. Her son's careful handwriting on the envelope was still visible. Ryan Cole took the ticket, glanced at it, then frowned. "This could have been moved," he said. "These things happen." Margaret almost smiled at that. She had lived long enough to know how often rules changed when the wrong person stood in front of them. "My son mailed it 2 weeks ago," she answered. "He said he wanted to see me when he walked across that stage." Around them, guests shifted in their seats. Some watched openly now. Others stared forward while listening to every syllable. A little girl in a white dress tugged her father's sleeve and whispered something. He answered without taking his eyes off the scene. Margaret noticed the child and softened for a second. Then she looked back toward the stage. The Navy band was warming up near the side curtain. Brass notes drifted through the hall, bright and formal. It was the same sound she had once heard at ceremonies long ago, before gray touched her hair, before loss had taught her patience, before motherhood had become the mission that mattered most. In the inside pocket of her handbag rested a small bronze emblem wrapped in tissue. The eagle, globe, and anchor she had earned decades earlier. She had not planned to bring it, but this morning something told her to carry it. Not to show anyone. Just to remember who she had been before the world learned to mistake silence for weakness. Derek stepped closer, lowering his tone as though kindness could be imitated. "Listen, we are trying to help you avoid embarrassment. Families of top graduates are seated here. Admirals, donors, command staff. Important people." Margaret's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "My son is important," she said. Ryan exhaled sharply. "Ma'am, enough. You are holding up the row." He gestured toward the aisle leading to the back. "Please move now." The nearest guests pretended discomfort, but no one spoke. Wealth often prefers silence when courage is required. Margaret turned her eyes once more to the empty line of chairs. On stage where the graduates would soon sit in white dress uniforms. Somewhere behind the curtain, Ethan Hayes was preparing for the proudest moment of his young life, completely unaware that his mother was being measured by strangers who knew nothing about her. She thought of the nights she worked double shifts to keep food on the table. The college forms filled out at the kitchen counter. The train rides to visit him during training. The letter he sent after his first difficult week that simply read, "I stayed because you taught me not to quit." Derek reached for the back of the front row chair and pulled it slightly aside, blocking the narrow path completely. "Last chance," he said. Margaret inhaled slowly, then stepped back on her own terms. There was dignity even in retreat. "I will not ruin my son's day," she said softly. "That belongs to him." She turned toward the aisle. Several guests relaxed, assuming the matter was over. They had no idea the real ceremony was only seconds from beginning. Margaret Hayes had taken only 3 steps toward the back aisle when the first notes of the ceremonial march echoed through Grant Hall. Heads turned toward the stage, conversations stopped, and the audience rose almost as one. White uniforms began to file in from behind the curtain, row after row, polished shoes striking the floor in perfect rhythm. Pride moved through the room like a current. Margaret stepped aside near a marble column so others could pass, her hands folded calmly over her handbag. She would not let anyone see the sting in her eyes. Not today. On stage, the graduating class took their seats with disciplined precision. From the third row, Ethan Hayes scanned the crowd while keeping his posture straight. His jaw tightened slightly. The front row was filling. Admirals, officials, donors, smiling families. But seat 4 remained empty. He looked again, slower this time. Empty. A quiet unease moved across his face before discipline pulled it back into place. Beside Margaret, a young usher noticed her standing alone. "Ma'am, there are open seats in the rear balcony," he said kindly. Unlike the guards, he spoke with respect. Margaret nodded. "Thank you." She Started toward the stairs, but something made her glance back one more time. On stage, Ethan was still searching the crowd. A mother recognizes that look instantly. It was the same look he wore at age 8 when he lost sight of her in a grocery store. The same look he had at 17 before his first interview, pretending confidence while hoping she was near. Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to wave. She wanted to call out. Instead, she simply placed one hand over her heart. Across the hall, Ethan's eyes landed on her for a brief second. Relief flashed across his face so quickly most would have missed it. Then his gaze dropped to where she stood, alone at the side wall rather than in the seat he had reserved. Confusion followed. Then understanding. His eyes moved toward the front row guards. Ryan Cole was whispering something to Derek Mills, both men smug with the satisfaction of a problem handled. Ethan's expression changed in a way neither guard noticed. It did not become angry. It became still. The kind of stillness forged through training, pressure, and self-control. The superintendent stepped to the podium and welcomed the audience. Applause rolled through the hall. Cameras lifted. Families smiled through tears. Yet on stage, Ethan heard almost none of it. His mind had gone to every sacrifice his mother had made to put him in that chair. He remembered winter mornings when she warmed the old car 10 minutes early so he would not be late for school. He remembered the second job she took when tuition rose. He remembered the day he almost quit officer training after a brutal week, and the voice message she left him, "Hayes men finish what they start." He had played it 12 times that night. The superintendent continued speaking about duty, leadership, and honor. Fine words, polished words. But Ethan's gaze stayed on the woman standing by the column in a simple navy dress, treated like an inconvenience in the very room celebrating values she had lived for decades. Then something else happened. A side door near the rear of the auditorium opened. At first only a few people noticed. Then more heads turned. A hush spread slowly, then all at once. 12 men entered in dark formal uniforms, moving with quiet precision that needed no announcement. Their posture alone commanded attention. Their presence changed the temperature of the room. Ryan Cole straightened immediately. Derek Mills stopped mid-sentence. The audience whispered 2 words again and again like wind through leaves. SEAL teams. At their center walked a tall commander with silver at his temples and eyes that missed nothing. He did not look toward the stage. He looked directly at Margaret Hayes. The commander crossed the aisle with measured steps, and the 11 men behind him moved in silent formation, each one composed, alert, and unmistakably disciplined. No one needed an introduction. The room recognized excellence when it entered. Conversations died mid-whisper. Even the superintendent at the podium lowered his notes, uncertain whether to continue. Margaret Hayes remained beside the marble column, her hand still resting lightly on her handbag. For the first time that morning, surprise touched her face. The commander stopped 3 feet in front of her and stood at attention. His voice, when it came, was calm and clear enough to carry across the hall. Staff Sergeant Margaret Hayes, United States Marine Corps, retired. A ripple moved through the audience. Ryan Cole blinked hard. Derek Mills looked from Margaret to the commander as if trying to force reality into a shape he understood. Margaret gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "It has been a long time since anyone used that title," she said softly. The commander's expression warmed, but only slightly. "Respect does not expire, ma'am." Then, in one motion so precise it seemed rehearsed by memory itself, he raised his hand in salute. Behind him, the 11 others did the same. 12 salutes held in perfect stillness before the entire auditorium. The room froze. Margaret's eyes glistened, though her chin never trembled. Slowly, she returned the salute. It was crisp, instinctive, and exact. Some habits are not learned twice. On stage, Ethan Hayes sat motionless, emotion pressing against every rule of military composure he had trained to maintain. The cadet beside him swallowed hard and stared forward, pretending not to witness history happening 10 yards away. The commander lowered his hand. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." Margaret let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh. "You always did anyway, Commander Reed." A few quiet chuckles broke through the tension. Lucas Reed nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. That has been said before." He turned slightly, enough for the audience to hear him without losing focus on her. 26 years ago, during a flood evacuation in North Carolina, then Sergeant Hayes coordinated civilian extraction under impossible conditions. "My team was young, overconfident, and trapped behind rising water after a vehicle failure." He paused. "She found us, reorganized the route, and got every one of us out." The silence deepened. It was no longer awkward silence. It was reverence. Reed continued. "Many people in this room know medals, rank, and titles. But some of the finest service never reaches a headline. We are standing here because this woman taught us that leadership is what you do when no one is watching." One of the men behind him, broad-shouldered with a scar near his temple, spoke without breaking formation. "She also gave me her dry gloves that night, ma'am. Mine were soaked." Another added, "and made us stop complaining." Laughter rose gently through the hall, the kind born from admiration rather than entertainment. Margaret shook her head with modest disbelief. "You all remember too much." Reed answered immediately. "We remember exactly enough." In the front row, Ryan Cole's posture had collapsed into uncertainty. Derek Mills stared at the floor, then at the empty seat 4, then back at the woman he had dismissed minutes earlier. The expensive guests who had watched silently now avoided one another's eyes. Wealth had filled the room earlier. Character had only just arrived. Reed glanced toward the stage and saw Ethan Hayes. Their eyes met. Reed's expression shifted into something proud. "And today," he said, raising his voice for all to hear, "her son graduates to serve this country. We would consider it an honor if Staff Sergeant Hayes would take the seat that belongs to her." Then he turned toward Ryan and Derek. "Gentlemen," he said politely, "perhaps you could escort her to the front row now." No one moved for a heartbeat. The request had been polite, but it landed with the force of command. Ryan Cole swallowed first. He stepped aside so quickly the chair he had used to block the aisle nearly brushed the row behind him. Derek Mills reached for seat 4, straightening it with nervous hands that had lost every trace of confidence. "Ma'am," Ryan said, his voice smaller than before, "please allow us." Margaret Hayes looked at both men for a long moment. There was no triumph in her eyes, no desire to embarrass them in return. Only calm. "Thank you," she said, and the simple courtesy stung more than anger ever could. Commander Lucas Reed stepped back as Margaret walked toward the front row. The 11 men behind him separated just enough to create a clear path, standing like an honor corridor through the center aisle. Guests who had earlier watched in silence now shifted out of the way with hurried politeness. Several rose to their feet without being asked. Others followed, then more, until the entire auditorium stood. The applause began softly from the rear balcony, where the young usher had witnessed everything. It spread row by row until Grant Hall filled with the sound of respect finally waking up. Margaret paused once, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Reed leaned slightly toward her. "You earned every clap, ma'am." She answered under her breath, "I only came to watch my son graduate." Reed smiled. And now he knows exactly what he comes from. On stage, Ethan Hayes fought to remain composed. Military bearing required stillness, but pride is difficult to hide when it rises from the soul. His eyes shone openly now. The cadets around him began applauding as well, some discreetly at first, then with full hands and straight backs. They were not applauding a scene. They were applauding a standard. Margaret reached row A. Derek pulled the chair back for her with both hands. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. She set one hand on the chair before sitting. "Then learn from it," she replied. "That is enough." Ryan stood beside him, face flushed. "I judged too quickly." Margaret nodded once. "Many people do. Fewer choose to grow after." She sat in seat 4 at last, smoothing her navy dress at the knees. The envelope with Ethan's name rested in her lap. For the first time that morning, she looked exactly where she belonged. Commander Reed turned to the podium. "Please continue, sir." The superintendent, visibly humbled, cleared his throat and adjusted the papers he no longer seemed to trust. "Yes. Of course." His voice shook slightly on the first sentence. The ceremony resumed, but everything had changed. Words like honor, sacrifice, and leadership no longer sounded ceremonial. They had a face now. They had gray-blue eyes, steady hands, and a simple navy dress in the front row. Names were called one by one. Families cheered. Cameras flashed. Yet the room's attention returned again and again to Margaret Hayes, not because she sought it, but because dignity has a gravity of its own. Then the announcer reached the final honors list. With distinction for academic excellence and leadership, Cadet Ethan Hayes. Applause thundered again. Ethan rose, marched across the stage, and received his diploma with perfect form. As he turned, he broke protocol only enough to glance toward seat 4. Margaret placed one hand over her heart exactly as she had earlier by the column. Ethan's jaw tightened with emotion, then he saluted her from the stage. It was crisp, controlled, and visible to all. Margaret returned it instantly. Some people in the audience wiped tears they did not expect to feel that morning. Commander Reed stood straighter. Even Ryan and Derek joined the applause with sincerity now. Because everyone in that room understood something they had missed when the day began. Rank can be printed. Wealth can be displayed. But honor reveals itself quietly, often in the people others underestimate first. The ceremony ended beneath a standing ovation that seemed unwilling to fade. Families crowded the aisles with flowers, cameras, and tearful laughter, but around seat 4 there remained a respectful pocket of space, as if people understood instinctively that something larger than graduation had taken place. There. Margaret Hayes rose slowly, still holding Ethan's envelope in one hand and the program in the other. Commander Lucas Reed approached first, no longer formal now, just grateful. "Congratulations, ma'am," he said. "You raised a fine officer." Margaret gave him a look only an old Marine could give. "He raised himself the last few years. I only reminded him to keep going." Reed smiled. "That sounds like leadership to me." Before she could answer, Ethan Hayes moved through the crowd in white dress uniform, diploma tucked beneath one arm. He did not rush. He carried himself with the discipline drilled into him for years. But when he reached his mother, discipline gave way to something deeper. He embraced her tightly, and for a moment the crowded hall disappeared for both of them. "You were standing in the back," he said quietly. "I saw." Margaret touched his cheek like she had when he was 10. "And I saw you graduate. That was the only mission today." Ethan shook his head. "You should have been in the front from the start." She smiled gently. "I was exactly where I needed to be. So were you." Nearby guests pretended to check phones while listening closely. Some truths are too valuable to ignore. Ryan Cole and Derek Mills approached with hesitant steps. Their posture had changed more than their uniforms. Pride had left. Humility had entered. Ryan spoke first. "Cadet Hayes, Mrs. Hayes, I want to apologize for how we treated you both." Ethan looked at them, then at his mother. Margaret answered before he could. "My son has a career ahead of him. I do not need anger attached to his day." Derek lowered his eyes. We made assumptions. Margaret nodded once. Then make fewer tomorrow than you made today. Neither man had a response stronger than silence. Commander Reed glanced toward them and then to Ethan. Your mother corrected men like us for years, he said dryly. You are seeing the gentle version. Even Margaret laughed at that, and tension broke like a cloud finally releasing sunlight. Families began gathering for photographs. A woman in pearls who had ignored Margaret earlier now stepped forward awkwardly. Mrs. Hayes, would you mind if my daughter met you? She wants to serve one day. Margaret welcomed the young girl with warmth that made the mother's embarrassment unnecessary. Service begins before uniforms, she told her. Keep your word. Show up on time. Help people when no one is watching. The rest can be learned. The girl nodded as if receiving sacred instruction. Outside, the afternoon breeze moved across the academy lawn, carrying the sounds of celebration and distant harbor bells. Ethan walked beside his mother down the stone steps while graduates posed beneath flags and bright blue sky. I saved your seat because I wanted everyone to know who got me here, he said. Margaret adjusted the collar of his uniform with practiced fingers. Then learn this now, she replied. You do not honor people by placing them in front rows. You honor them by how you live after today. Ethan stood very still, letting the words settle. Reed and the 11 others paused at the bottom of the steps and saluted one final time before departing without fanfare, as quietly as they had arrived. Margaret returned the salute, then slipped the old eagle, globe, and anchor emblem back into her handbag. No audience saw that small motion except Ethan. He smiled. He understood. Some medals shine on jackets. Others live in character. As mother and son walked into the sunlight together, those who had witnessed the morning carried home a lesson no speech from the podium had managed to teach. The loudest titles can impress a room, but quiet dignity can transform one. 3 days later, the story had traveled farther than anyone inside Grant Hall could have imagined. Short clips filmed on phones spread across military family groups, alumni pages, and local news feeds. There was no dramatic music, no staged performance, no polished editing needed. Just a simple woman in a navy dress being overlooked, then honored by men whose respect could not be purchased. America has always understood that kind of story. At a small diner 20 miles outside Annapolis, Margaret Hayes sat in a corner booth stirring coffee she had barely touched. Morning sunlight fell across the checkered floor, and the smell of toast and bacon drifted through the room. She had chosen the diner because no one there usually asked questions. But that morning, people kept glancing toward her, then back to their phones. On the screen of a nearby table, she recognized herself standing beside the marble column. Margaret sighed softly. So much for quiet breakfast. Ethan Hayes slid into the booth across from her, now dressed in jeans and a plain sweatshirt instead of his formal uniform. Too late for that, he said with a grin. You are trending with retired Marines, Navy families, and half the East Coast. Margaret gave him a look. That sentence alone tells me society has become strange. Ethan laughed, then grew serious. Mom, people love what happened because it was real. She reached for the sugar packets and lined them into a neat row out of habit. People love moments. They should love principles. Ethan leaned forward. Maybe moments are how principles get remembered. She glanced at him with quiet pride. He sounded older now, steadier somehow. Graduation had given him rank. Yesterday had given him perspective. The waitress approached nervously, notepad in hand. Mrs. Hayes. Margaret looked up kindly. Just Margaret. The woman smiled. I saw the video. My son is 17. He thinks manners are optional. Would you mind saying hello to him? Before Margaret could answer, a tall teenager appeared from the kitchen doorway, suddenly shy. Flour dusted one sleeve of his apron. Margaret stood and shook his hand. Your mother works hard, she said. Start there. The boy nodded as if enlisted into something noble. After he returned to the kitchen, Ethan smiled. You know, you just changed that kid's week. Margaret sat back down. Then I hope he changes his mother's dishes tonight. Across town, Ryan Cole and Derek Mills were having a different morning. They had been reassigned to community protocol training after multiple complaints surfaced from previous guests who had never bothered to speak before. Public embarrassment often inspires private honesty. Their supervisor had one instruction: treat every person as if they matter before you know whether they do. It was a lesson they should have learned long ago. Back at the diner, Commander Lucas Reed entered wearing civilian clothes and carrying a bakery box. I come in peace, he announced. And with cinnamon rolls. Margaret shook her head. You men always arrive like operations teams. Reed sat beside Ethan. Occupational habit. He placed the box on the table and looked at Margaret more seriously. I wanted to tell you something. Since that ceremony, 3 younger operators called me. They said the clip reminded them why humility matters. Margaret stirred her coffee again. Then maybe some good came from my inconvenient morning. Reed smiled. More than you know. The diner television above the counter replayed the salute scene with a news anchor calling it a powerful reminder not to judge by appearances. Margaret barely glanced at it. She was watching Ethan laugh with Reed over something trivial. That was the reward she cared about. Not views. Not headlines. Not praise. A son stepping into manhood with character still intact. As they finished breakfast, Margaret reached for the bill. The waitress shook her head. Already covered. Margaret frowned. By whom? The waitress pointed toward the kitchen. The teenage boy gave a small wave through the service window. Margaret smiled warmly and left the cash anyway beneath the mug. Because respect given freely is beautiful, but gratitude returned is even better. That afternoon, Ethan Hayes and Margaret drove north along the Chesapeake Bay in his rented sedan with the windows cracked just enough to let spring air roll through the car. The academy grounds had faded behind them, but the morning still lingered in both their minds. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the folded graduation program on the center console. I still cannot believe Commander Reed showed up with 11 others, he said. Margaret looked out at the water flashing silver in the sun. Lucas always enjoyed dramatic timing. Ethan laughed. You say that like it was normal. With him, it often was. They rode in comfortable silence for a mile before Ethan spoke again. Why did you never tell me more about your service? Margaret considered the question carefully. Because I did not want you borrowing pride you had not earned yet. Ethan nodded slowly. That answer sounded exactly like her. They arrived at a quiet waterfront park where picnic tables overlooked the harbor. Children chased gulls across the grass while older couples walked hand in hand along the path. Nothing about the place was remarkable, which made it perfect for conversation. Margaret sat on a bench facing the water while Ethan brought 2 lemonades from a snack stand. He handed one to her and sat beside her like he had as a boy whenever life felt bigger than he understood. Did it bother you? He asked. What happened at the ceremony? Margaret took a sip before answering. Not as much as it should bother them. Ethan frowned. I was angry. I know. I still am. She turned to him gently. Then use it wisely. He looked away toward the boats rocking in their slips. How? Margaret pointed toward a young groundskeeper nearby picking up trash others had left behind. That man is serving people who may never thank him. Start by noticing people like that. Respect should be practiced before it is tested. Ethan let the word settle. They always landed deeper when she spoke softly. A family walking past recognized him from graduation and asked for a photo. Ethan hesitated, then agreed kindly. The father thanked him for choosing service. The mother thanked Margaret for raising him. When they walked away, Ethan smiled awkwardly. This attention feels strange. Good, Margaret said. Anything that feeds ego too easily should feel strange. He laughed again, then grew thoughtful. Did you ever regret leaving the Corps? The harbor breeze lifted a few strands of her hair. No. Seasons change. I served there, then I served at home. Ethan stared at the water. You make everything sound simple. Most truths are simple, she replied. Living them is the difficult part. Later, as the sun lowered, Ethan received a message on his phone. He read it and blinked. Commander Reed invited us to dinner tonight. Private gathering. Says some old teammates want to thank you properly. Margaret sighed with theatrical exhaustion. I was hoping for leftovers and early sleep. Ethan grinned. Too late. You are famous now. She gave him the same stern look that once stopped teenage excuses in their tracks. Do not ever confuse attention with importance. He raised both hands in surrender. Yes, ma'am. They stood to leave, but before reaching the parking lot, Ethan paused. Mom. Yes. When I looked for you this morning and saw your seat empty, I felt ashamed that I was up there while you were standing alone. Margaret stepped closer and straightened the collar of his sweatshirt, though it needed no fixing. Then remember this feeling, she said. Whenever someone under your command stands alone, go stand beside them. Ethan's eyes sharpened with understanding. That was the lesson beneath every lesson. Not speeches. Not medals. Responsibility. As they walked toward the car, the gulls cried overhead and sunlight turned the bay gold. Ethan opened the passenger door for her without being asked. Margaret noticed but said nothing. Real growth often arrives quietly, in gestures too small for applause. That evening, Commander Lucas Reed hosted the gathering at a modest waterfront restaurant tucked behind a marina where fishing boats rocked gently against their ropes. It was the kind of place with worn wooden floors, framed photographs on the walls, and food good enough that no one cared about appearances. Margaret Hayes approved immediately. Finally, she said as they entered, a room that values substance. Ethan laughed and held the door for her. Inside, several men rose from a long table near the windows. Some were broad-shouldered, some gray at the temples, one walked with a slight stiffness in his knee, but every one of them carried the same unmistakable presence of discipline tempered by years. They greeted Margaret not with spectacle this time, but with warmth. Reed pulled out a chair for her. No ceremonies tonight, ma'am. Just gratitude. Good, Margaret replied. I left my patients at the academy. Laughter rolled across the table. Plates arrived, glasses clinked, and stories followed. One man told Ethan how his mother once made a group of exhausted young operators rebuild a temporary shelter because they had cut corners the first time. Another admitted she caught him trying to skip kitchen duty and had him peeling potatoes for 3 straight nights. A third said, she was harder on us than any instructor, and somehow kinder than all of them. Ethan listened in amazement. He had known his mother as the woman who packed lunches, balanced bills, and reminded him to change the oil in the car. Now he was meeting versions of her that had shaped grown men into better ones. Margaret rolled her eyes at the stories. You all survived just fine. Reed shook his head. We did more than survive. You set standards. As dinner ended, the restaurant owner approached their table carrying a small framed photograph. Mrs. Hayes, he said, I think this belongs with you tonight. Margaret took it carefully. It was an old faded picture of a younger version of herself standing beside flood vehicles in soaked fatigues, arms crossed, expression unimpressed. Around her stood a dozen young men looking tired, muddy, and very attentive. Ethan stared. You kept this from me? Margaret examined the photo with quiet nostalgia. I forgot it existed. Reed smiled. Some of us never did. On the drive back to the hotel, Ethan was quieter than usual. Streetlights passed over the windshield in soft intervals. Finally he spoke. All these years, you never asked for recognition. Margaret looked ahead through the glass. Recognition is pleasant. Character is necessary. Learn the difference early. He nodded. I think I am starting to. The next morning came quickly. Ethan stood outside the hotel in travel clothes, duffel bag over one shoulder, preparing to report for his next assignment. The sky was pale blue, and the city had not fully woken yet. Margaret handed him a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Open it later, she said. He hugged her tightly. Thank you for everything. No, she replied, stepping back. Live in a way that honors everything. He climbed into the shuttle, then lowered the window. I love you, Mom. She smiled the same smile from his childhood. I know. Now go be useful. Hours later, somewhere on the highway, Ethan opened the box. Inside lay the bronze eagle, globe, and anchor emblem she had carried to graduation, polished clean and wrapped in tissue. Beneath it was a handwritten note in careful script. Titles can be given. Respect must be earned daily. Protect the overlooked. Stand beside the isolated. Lead quietly. He read it twice, then looked out at the road ahead with different eyes. Back in Annapolis, Margaret checked out of the hotel, carried her own suitcase, and declined help twice before accepting it once just to be gracious. No cameras followed her. No crowd noticed. She walked into the morning like any ordinary woman. But many people who met her after that day looked twice before making judgments too quickly. And somewhere across the country, a new officer began his career knowing the strongest people in the room are often the ones who never announce themselves.